Should I go from the top?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Elliot Waloschek. I'm a poet and an artist. I've been writing poetry since I was 9 years old. I joined a poetry collective when I was like 15, 16. And I'd done workshops before that, but that collective, the Roundhouse Poetry Collective, was really where I started like having, I don't know, I guess like a bigger vision of what poetry was and what you could do with it. I think the most like important time I performed was at a concert at my school actually. But there were like a lot of people there, and I performed like my first ever poem that I'd ever written and performed about like being trans or being queer, and like the response that I had from that was just kind of crazy to me, because I had never even written about it before because I was like so ashamed, and the poem itself was about shame, and then it like just resonated with so many unexpected people. I only really get properly nervous like right before I get on stage. Before then that's fine, and then there's like a brief moment of like, oh shit. But then you're on stage, and afterwards it was just like a weight off my shoulders to just be like sharing like parts of myself, and in the process kind of like learning about myself as well. There's also like the moment when you're writing the words first and you just have like the pure image, and the wordplay which just appears out of nowhere, and that part is just like so exhilarating, but it's so chaotic. Like I don't feel like I ever go in like, this is the plan for the poem and it's gonna be saying this. It's like halfway through the poem I'm like, actually I don't agree with whatever philosophy the poem is now holding, so I need to make some major changes and maybe just like throw the poem like upside down, and take out this whole chunk, put it somewhere else, like just rearrange everything. Usually like it naturally, like I can go to a really dark place, but it's the sudden like presence of light, or the possibility of it, which is always there. It means that those words do have power and they can really help people or influence people or change the way people see something. I wouldn't say that's my goal going into it, because I think it's, once you have that as your goal, I don't think you're gonna be that happy maybe, but if it just happens because you're honest, then sweet. I had to make like a definition for poetry recently, and I said poetry is what is on the other side of the nausea. And I feel like in itself what a poem should do is kind of almost be comforting in the way that you think, okay, I have all this nausea and confusion, but always on the other side of it there is this like moment of clarity. Like if you go into a poem writing about something you're uncomfortable with, and say you do it in third person, and then you've written the whole poem and you just switch everything to first person, like it's kind of a cheat code into certain kinds of vulnerability. There's also just like, there's certain things I would maybe want to write about, but it's uncomfortable because the people who would be involved in it are alive and they might see the poem. And it's not like I'm about to write a damning report of anyone, but I guess that's not the point. Like, you're trying to process stuff, the good and the bad, but I still have just this like this fear of, you know, like I find it difficult to write about my parents or about relationships that I'm in, or what's going on in there, because you never know how people are going to take it. Some people just like plow through that and they're like, I'm going to write about sex and I don't care if my mummy sees it. My mum will come to everything and she'll send me opportunities, like literally I'll write a poem and I'll send it to her and I'll be like, what do you think of this? Like she's really like tuned in and she knows me as well, so she's like, this bit, like, you really try to say that? And I might be like, yep, I am. And then my dad is kind of like, he's not very good with words in some ways, and he's not that he's not good with words, he's just very quiet, he doesn't use them very often, and he never like really understood poetry, but when he comes to see my shows, he'll cry, and it clearly means a lot to him, so that's super sweet. Someone sent me something interesting on poetry recently, which was about how people write poetry because they have this like need to tap into something infinite, which I guess kind of sounds dicky, but the more I think about it, the more I agree with it. Poetry is just like this thing which exists outside of us and moves through us, and then we move through it, and there's like a kind of infinite web that we're all tapped into, and there's no such thing as individuals. There's always just serendipitous moments, like, I mean, there was one which is kind of very easily to explain why it's crazy, but I got top surgery and 2 weeks later I had a performance, like the Roundhouse poetry. The poem that I was performing was about like waiting for top surgery and like the long waiting list times in the UK, and then more generally about waiting and being patient about becoming. And I was performing a poem about waiting, and the last line is like, you'll make it through the waiting, and I already had. So it was, I don't know, it was crazy to literally go up on stage with my new body and perform a poem with my whole body and also embody the poem. That was kind of mental, just to have it as this space that I was moving through. Like I wrote the poem, and then I moved through the poem and I came out the other end, and then I just performed that story. That shit was crazy. Bloody frogs, legs spread on the bed, growing pains bled raw from inside of them. Skin in the heat sheathed into the beat. Eggs in the freezer is an unknown future, playing God in a syringe. Poetry is everywhere. It is the synthesizing of experience into language, of consciousness into language and form. It is a fluid thing, or a plane of existence that moves through us and the world. It is what is on the other side of the nausea. It is trusting the gaps and the holes. You rip open an experience and you make it into a 3D space that you can walk through and explore. It has the same thing as philosophy, because you're like constantly walking towards more questions, and sometimes you stop and you're like, well, that's the question, but it's never it kind of never really concludes. But if people resonate with shit, and people have said that they do, and that even if they're not going through transition, and then even if they're not queer, they still completely see themselves or in the story. I think that's the best thing, because it just bridges gaps between people, and that's definitely the effect I have reading other people's poetry. It's like you just bridge gaps, you become part of the web. And that's like priceless.